Hello and welcome to the Program to BIM webinar. This is Kimon Onuma. A few things before we get started. This session will be recorded and posted on the website, and we will be taking questions from the audience, from the owners in the audience actually. We'll explain that a little bit later as well, but there's a question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. So if you do have questions, please post them there. In today's session, we will have 4 speakers. We'll have Van Woods from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Renee Tejan from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and John Roach from Murphy Tate, and myself, Kimon Onuma from Onuma Inc. We're all members of the Building Smart Alliance, Thought Leadership, and Van Woods is on the board of direction of the Building Smart Alliance as well, so we wear multiple hats. We're excited to bring you this webinar presentation. We have the support of the Asset Leadership Network and the Building Smart Alliance, and this is being sponsored by Onuma BIMstorm. Today's webinar is. So people, money, and stuff. The Asset Leadership Network, and Jim Dieter likes to describe it this way. You can divide assets into people, money, and stuff. A lot of resources are spent on managing people and finances, but there isn't as much effort into managing stuff. So what is this stuff? The stuff is everything else around us. It's the buildings, the equipment inside the buildings, other assets, even the movable assets, and from an assets perspective, it's even the fleets and the equipment and trucks. But today we're going to be focusing on the stuff centered around buildings and facilities and for owners. And this is an important point. We have 4 webinars set up for this month. This particular webinar is geared towards owners. We're inviting anybody to join and listen in, but we're kind of putting the hat on of owners talking to owners so the rest of the industry can hear what owners are thinking. And the next set of webinars are going to be looking at other perspectives of AEC industry, manufacturers, and IT professionals and how they can actually interact with the needs of the owner. So all the stuff around us that is moving and is in buildings, there's a lot of great information and data that's stored in these buildings, but unfortunately it's very difficult to get to it from an owner's perspective. Owners are managing facilities and portfolios, but even with building information models, it's very difficult for a lot of owners to even open up a BIM, for example. So how can owners get the value out of the stuff that's around them, their buildings and facilities? And for example, even counting things, counting stuff, how much space do we have, how much square footage do we have? This is an actual sketch from an actual project that started off by even saying, well, what's in this existing huge building that we need to renovate? There's not a lot of good information. There's a lot of good information embedded in different tools and different databases, but it's very difficult to access, and it's almost like we're starting from square one as an owner if you're looking at how do we start to renovate a building or design or construct a building. And even with the great digital tools that are out there, even finding things is very difficult. Even digital information a lot of times is hard to find or in the wrong format. So how do we actually look at all of the stuff and data that we have and actually make it more easily accessible? That's what the focus of this webinar is. How do we make it easier to actually achieve what we need to do with our information? We need structure to be able to get to that information, but also the complexity of the building industry there's kind of a dilemma there. There is a great work that's been done by the Building Smart Alliance and other standards organizations to categorize and create that structure, create the standards for BIM, create the IFCs and the COBE and all that. But it's really complex in many ways from an owner's perspective to really even get to that information, and it just becomes more piles of documents or files, even in BIM or in standards. And that's a challenge, and that's one that we want to address with our talk today. So there's a white paper on the National Institute of Building Sciences website. The Academy for Healthcare Infrastructure Council put out a series of white papers, and this was one of them. And we layered over this curve that some of you might be familiar with, the McClamey curve, but this is going over the entire life cycle. The challenge of jumping from kind of business needs of the owner into pre-design funding, design and construction of a single building or facility, going into occupancy and then operating one building or thousands of buildings. And if you look at this curve, our presentation today is we can actually make this curve much more efficient. There's a way to do that today. This was actually identified in a project that we were involved with the U.S. Coast Guard way back in 2004 of how do we cut across these silos, how do we make information more accessible at every stage along the way. And there is a way to do that. If you think in terms of not the maximum amount of information that's available in a building and facility, but what's the minimum thread that actually helps us tie that together? And what's the technology that will allow us to get that thread to start talking to these different silos? With a series of projects through the National Institute of Building Sciences that we were involved with as well, it was identified that the White House 21st Century Digital Strategy that is very much in alignment with what's happening with the IT world around us about how do you manage information and make it neutral and make it accessible to many different applications and end users. You basically split it up into layers, and we described it as Legos. We said, okay, if you think in terms of Lego, the black box on the left is how applications and software have been typically built in the past, where you basically put information into a box, into that software, and then it becomes very difficult to move it between different software applications. With an open architecture like this, you can actually take the data outside and split it away from, neutralize it from a specific application, then create a services layer. Basically, how do we get to the data? And then as you start needing new functionality, you can plug in applications on top of this. And that's how this modular approach, and even the world we live in today with our mobile applications, we plug and play different software into this. We can grow from that. And our expectation is to be able to get to the data quickly and easily, and regardless of the device that we're using. So this stuff in the buildings around us, as owners, we need to be able to get it in an easy way. And we've created a facilities and assets, a lifecycle playbook. What's the minimum buck that you can spend to get the maximum bang, basically? How do you simplify the instructions down? And we broke it down into 9 steps. And today we're actually going to focus on a few of those steps. And they're actually very simple steps, very simple but incredibly powerful and that have a lot of impact. The first one is just basically saying, what do you where is your information and where is your data? What do you have? What do you own? What are the list of spaces and buildings and equipment that you have that are mixed in PDF files and Word documents and databases? The second step is to actually list it in a tabular format, just like an Excel file. Get it listed and make it structured enough at a very basic level, and then to host it somewhere and then actually use it. Mandate the use of it is number 5. Once you have it in a central place, if everybody uses the same information and same IDs, you can start doing stuff with it. You can start making decisions about design, construction, and operations. And these are very simple first steps. There's obviously complications and other challenges of how you get to that, but we want to walk you through that in this presentation. And you'll see these numbers scattered throughout the slides as we go through this. So keep these numbers in mind, and we'll come back to these at the end as well, too. So first up, we're going to have John Roach from Murphy Tate. John, are you ready to speak?
Hello. I am. Thanks, Timon.
Thanks for joining us.
The owners face a dilemma, and we've seen this in working both with the Defense Health Agency and in my experience previously with the California community colleges and dozens, hundreds of owners that we've spoken to. We're overwhelmed with information. There's always been a need for good information about our buildings, but the Internet of Things, this connections and equipment that promise a high volume of great data, can overwhelm us as owners. And on top of that, we have a group of stakeholders, all of us, that are coming from this environment of an app for that world, where we expect real-time data about all facets of our lives, including our buildings. And it's easy to see how prior technology got us here, even from the old days of having to share documents about our buildings on floppy disk, or the central servers that were so popular around the year 2000. All of these were vitally important at their time, but they're not adequate for today's environment, but the technology does exist. Timon has been introducing us to a lot of that, and we'll talk more as we go through this series of presentations. But it's important to remember that while we have the connected data helps everyone, the owners have better access to collections of tools that help them address very specific needs. Vendors have access to a larger, more diverse pool of customers. And then the stakeholders, in turn, gain access to the faster delivery of good data. But in order to keep perpetuating this and to build on this environment, owners need to think about 4 key steps. We need to increase awareness within our organizations of the existence of the data and the fact that we don't need to throw old data out and replace it with new. We simply need to start early and adopt the information we have. We need to have an honest conversation internal to our organizations about the opportunities that exist for linking the data, but more importantly, or as importantly, understanding the risks of not linking that information. In order to do that, there has to be focused conversations about standardizing data. But standardizing data doesn't need to be an exhaustive exercise. You don't need to standardize all the data at once. You need to focus on specific uses that you have. Focus on the data set that allows you to connect 2 or 3 important bits that allow you to answer specific questions. And then mandate the requirements that allow that standardized data to be used and reused as the process grows over time. Another facet is owners need to focus on viewing the contract language they use to ensure that they own their own data about their buildings and their assets. The technology will evolve and change. Owners need to make sure that they have ownership of the data so that they can keep up with the changes in technology as they unfold. And finally, we need to work with internal to our organizations to ensure that the workforce who know the buildings and the assets so well also have the tools and the training they need to adopt this interconnected data environment that we're all living in. Come on, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, John. So now we're going to talk a little bit from the Department of Veterans Affairs perspective. Renee Tejan and I have been working together for many years on a variety of projects, and her slides talk about something that's very interesting. If you think of a medical facility, it is the largest piece of medical equipment that the VA owns, the whole facility. And in terms of that, if that's the case, if you have inside of a facility the building and the stuff, basically the equipment and the rooms and the spaces, if you can't support the needs of the medical facility, you can't really support the patient. So in that case, if access to care for VA is the #1 priority, healthcare cannot be delivered without a medical facility. Then delivering healthcare means getting the facility faster and providing access to care. If you change the words here from healthcare and VA, you could pretty much apply this to any owner. Think in terms of your business objectives and what your core goals are and who your customer is, and the buildings and the facilities and the assets and the stuff basically that you manage and own are critical to making that happen. So how can we do that? How can VA do that? It's by streamlining the time and effort needed through reimagining the work process and deploying new technologies. There's plenty of great technologies around us. It's really how do we actually apply them and make them front and center to an owner's needs. And years ago, actually, probably it was about 4 years ago now, from the National Institute of Building Sciences, there was the BIM Healthcare Consortium, a group of healthcare owners, large healthcare owners and private and government agencies that looked at this problem and said, if you look at the life cycle, there are some pain points in the life cycle where you have the requirements that you have on the left of how do we define the requirements for design and construction of a single facility. Then you go into design and construction and you're interacting with the AEC community, the architects, engineers, and builders out there. And they're doing their thing with all the great tools that are out there with BIM. And then on the tail end, what they call the red dot, you have to then take that data and put it into your facility management applications, which have a different set of needs than the design and construction process. You have that highly complex data in design and construction. You have the facility management and operational data that you need and other types of uses for that data. There's multiple uses for that data, not just for facility management. For example, wayfinding and patient monitoring is related to space information. In the initial stages, they're saying, let's try and solve the red dot. Let's figure out how we get that working. But it was quickly realized through the group of owners that if they don't have at least the very basic structured data in on the blue dot side, then you're constantly chasing the standards of what do we call these things as we get them delivered, because the design and construction industry, if the right instructions are not given from the owner, the blue dot, to the design and construction industry, you're going to get a mixed bag of red dot data back, even if it's great data inside BIM, highly structured. If it's not aligned with your data, essentially you're getting a mixed version of data. So it's very important and critical from an owner to actually structure your data. This is basically going back to the playbook that we just talked about, that you have to inventory and catalog, create lists of things, and what do we call our spaces and equipment, share it in a way that others can access it, and then mandate the use of that data throughout the life cycle of the project. So, and then if we jump back into a space, VA and the Department of Defense Health Agency share this database that says, what do we call the stuff that we have in our healthcare facilities? They have 2,000 plus pieces of equipment that they catalog. It says, here are the things that we need to run a dental exam room. There needs to be a boom arm, there needs to be a chair. Here's the ID of that chair. And these are the actual IDs that you see on these things. Very simple kind of concept, but one that most owners that we've worked with do not really have. They do not. You have it in mixed formats. You have it in Word documents and Excel files and people's heads. But if you can get a common list together, which DoD and VA have done for years, and share that with everybody and say, here's what we call things. As you go through and define requirements, and as you start going into BIM, we're going to call these things with these numbers. A very, very basic fundamental concept of a database, but in a very simple format. So that's what the space and equipment planning system was for VA and DoD. And as of a couple of years ago, through this NIBS project that we mentioned, it was decided to move it into the web, and not only move it into the web, but make it accessible. Number 3, share the data with everybody, because this is not confidential data. There's nothing confidential about this. The world can see this, because this is what kind of stuff do we need inside a dental exam room. It's not the dental exam room that's going to be built in Washington, D.C. on a specific street. So that concept of security and access to information was critical for these owners, and that's what was made possible. And for the VA, this SEPS to BIM process was, okay, now that we have it structured and we have it accessible, what can we do with it? Can we start managing our standards and communicating that with the AEC industry and working with the designers and builders out there using the same data that we have? And that's the stage that we're in right now with the SEPS to BIM project. It's accessible, it's inventoried, it's accessible, the recipes are there. There's web services, that's called web services on the internet for others to access, and it results in faster access to care if everybody has access to the same information. And other industry partners, once you set the rules of here's what we call our data, then everybody can link to those rules, and it makes it easier for the software vendors, for example, to build applications on top of that, the Lego pieces, or for consultants to link into it. So that's the basic concept behind SEPS to BIM, and the amazing thing here is that this is not just a concept, this is actually in production already. As of last year, this is actually already running, so we'd like to jump into a quick demonstration. We'll jump away from the slides for a second and actually show you the site. And as we run through this, keep in mind that this is obviously focused on healthcare, but it can apply to any owner type, because if you break down the concept of data, it doesn't matter that it's a healthcare chair. I mean, in healthcare there's conference rooms, for example, but you just basically change the rules and change the structure and the background data, and it applies to all. So this sepstobim.org website has a good overview of things. There's tutorials and things, but I'm going to jump right into a tool. If I go back to the playbook, things are cataloged. We have objects tied to data, and we have tools, and we have databases on the web that are accessible, so you can build your own tools or use the utilities that are here or a combination of both. So this is an example I'm going to give of actually creating a request for 2 rooms. And these are IDs. This is the common IDs for the rooms that they call, what's a dental exam room? It's CRAO2 is a conference room, for example. So if you type this in, what this is actually doing from this website, if I hit proceed, it's hitting the US government server on max.gov, grabbing the latest list of things of what the VA and DoD call things, combining it with a database on the web, and creating a BIM from templates that have been cataloged, and sending me an email and saying, okay, here's the actual request for the 2 rooms that you just made, and you can actually go then and view those rooms. So if I go here and click on this, it basically brings up the browser. The browser is going and hitting the website, pulling up the latest data, pulling up the latest simple location data from BIM, and creating a building information modeling on the fly from the latest data. So if this morning, for example, VA and DoD went in, or VA went in this case, this is a VA standard here that we're looking at, and changed the requirements for this room, it would actually place that new piece of equipment in the room. This is a data-driven geometry of a BIM that can be used in a simple format like this, or used to interact with architects, engineers, and builders with other tools that they use like Revit and ArchiCAD and SketchUp. But within this browser, you can actually see that same data, and you can actually pull down Excel lists of it. It's incredibly powerful to think of it in these terms because this is a real-time access to information, essentially how we're used to working with our mobile devices to find an airline reservation. We're basically pulling in the data of what do these owners call the things that they use to build healthcare facilities. And here's a pull-down list of all of the departments that VA has in healthcare facilities. This is not an actual building yet, but these are their standards. So a dental service department, this is going to actually pull down a bunch of rooms, not just a single room. And then there's other tabs up here where you can actually get into project level. You'll notice that it hasn't asked for a login or anything. It's basically just asking for an email because we're saying this type of data, there's nothing secure about it. It's already published on the web as PDFs. PDFs are static. They get outdated, and having them live like this allows us to pull up real-time data and keep it fresh. In fact, we even have a freshness date here because this says this BIM is 0 days old. Because if you open this up 6 months from now, the standards may have changed. So if you have think of this in terms of real-time access to owner data to generate a graphic of what that owner requirements are for a single room, for a department of rooms, or for a 700,000 square foot healthcare facility. It's all just data in the background. And data crunching through databases is very fast as long as you have your standards and your inventory of what your data is in place. So that's a very critical point. So we'll flip back to the slides now and ask, we showed that, so I'll flip through these quickly. This is in case we didn't get on the web, but we have this on the slides, different vendors. And this one is actually interesting, so I'll pause here for a second, but there's a group called Atania that has a medical equipment database that also linked to the same database. So in the background, as these graphics are being generated, medical equipment planners can go and add additional data to it. Atania is a non-building information modeling application, and they do not use IFCs or COBIs, but their data is structured enough that if you link it to what was just shown, they are in alignment with all the spaces and equipment that were just demonstrated. So with that, you can continue to do design work with it and do all kinds of tracking and design and tracking deltas and a lot of the information that you need to track a project as an owner. So I'm going to pause here for a second and talk about what's the minimum, we call it the minimum viable BIM. In other words, what's the minimum amount of data that's needed to do what I just demonstrated with this SEPs to BIM process. And it's actually very, very simple. If you start with a minimum and you pull it into the different BIM applications, you can add graphics, but as an owner, what's the minimum you need to collect? So this is actually sample data from, and we've kind of simplified it a little bit for the slides, but it's basically these are the the rows of data that are needed. These are for rooms and departments. So in the gray box, for example, it has the name of the field, and we need to know the department that that room is part of. So the green box on the right is the maintenance department. Inside the maintenance department, there's a room called the workroom. There's a room code, a room number 101, and the size of the room and the ceiling height. And these are standards that were established, already being used by the STEP system. The next room is an office inside the administration. And the most important thing is here to have these room codes and have unique IDs. They could be a long string of IDs or another way to uniquely identify that room. This is room type number 1 and type number 2, and the room number is 101 and 102. It's as simple as that. And all owners have some format of this, usually in the wrong format, stacking PDFs or Words or people's heads, but getting it at least cataloged. What are the things that you track from the perspective of rooms and departments? This is a minimum set of data that's needed to generate what I just showed earlier of identifying that room. There's other additional attributes that can be added, but look, like John Roach said, you don't have to actually solve the whole puzzle and have everything cataloged beforehand. You just need the minimum set, and this is in complete alignment with what's known as the COBE standard as well in Building Smart. The white boxes here are optional ones from a VA's perspective. So if you change the names here from an owner's perspective, you can put in your standards based on this structure. The next list, this is the first list, was about rooms and departments, and this can also, you can add hundreds of other attributes to it. You can say, well, we have other 50 types of attributes that we want to track. That's possible as well too. There's just another list. From a data tabular list perspective, this is dead simple kind of lists of things that end up in the different CAD and BIM applications. The next list is equipment. What type of equipment goes inside that room? So the rooms that we saw earlier, room type 1 and room type 2, they have content. Content is the equipment, and there's how many pieces of that equipment. There's one in the first green column and one in the second green column, and 6 guest chairs in room number 2. Very simple table, and there's, from a data perspective, there could be a lot more happening in the background, but this is a minimum set of information that you as an owner can start cataloging, and if you structure this, make it accessible, then what we showed earlier is possible. And there's other optional attributes as well. So these two simple tables are what drove what I showed earlier live. In the background, this data was already cataloged by VA and DoD, DHA. They agreed to have what they call things, equipment type 1 through 2000. They agreed on how they call rooms. DNTG1 is a dental exam room. And the naming and the standardization of that room is critical to be unique between them, but it's not critical to be in alignment with the rest of the industry. It'd be nice if all the healthcare owners in the world agreed on what to call a dental exam chair, but that is not realistic to have to wait for that to happen before you start working with it. So the most important thing is to have some kind of structure to start with and then start working with it, because you need to get something done today. You can't wait 5 years from now until everybody decides on how do we call a dental exam room. And that, I think, is a very important point. As part of the Building Smart Alliance, which we've all been involved with for many years, we think great things are happening, but I think a lot of times the standards organizations get lost in wanting to catalog everything before you get started. We need to get started with what we have. There's already plenty of information there, and thinking about what's the minimum set of data we can do our job today, and then be able to communicate that consistently to our internal stakeholders as well as the consultants out there. So next up, we're going to have Van Woods from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Seattle District and the Board of Direction of Building Smart Alliance. Van, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Kimon, and appreciate the chance to talk about this. This is a big deal for the Corps. We're an owner's representative and also an owner-occupier. So we see a lot of owners. We see a lot of different facility types. We see a lot of people that are at different layers and degrees of maturity of their understanding of what they need and how they're going to express it. But you know, the Corps looks at all types of facility types, from data centers to hospitals to labs, not just, you know, typical military facility type things, but we also do barracks and hangars and things like that. But we've really been intrigued with what the Defense Health Agency and the Veterans Affairs have been doing, because they're really really leading in this area in terms of really understanding that you need to hand the data over. The red dot that Kimon referred to in terms of the red dot, blue dot, we have focused a lot on how do we just get the data to operations and maintenance. But really the kind of laboratory and hospital arena has already identified that they really also, it's equally if not more important to make sure that the program is being met, that they can express what they need, that they can check that they're getting what they need, and it's just a very, very forward-looking, and I think that the Corps is lucky that we have a CIO that's very much bought into and aligned with the President's digital government strategy. But I would kind of contend that even smaller owners or owners who don't really have the strategic level buy-in all the way from the top, you don't have to be a DHA or a VA to really get started in this. And I think that's a really good point that I think is being brought up. So the minimum viable BIM, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end here, but it's really a good way to get started regardless of where you are on this journey. So every owner, regardless of size, has to figure out how they're going to describe their requirements. As Kimon kind of described, there are probably already existing PDFs that you have or spreadsheets that in some way or another describe what your requirements are. Those are the things that you really need to look at and find ways to start getting value from it today. Not in some future vision of where BIM can help you 3 or 5 or 10 years from now, but I would contend that there are ways to plug this into the very earliest stages of your process right now. I referred to the importance of providing more valuable deliverables as an owner. We certainly want to receive deliverables at the end to perform operations and maintenance and to get that process started as soon as possible, even before beneficial occupancy, ideally. But even first and foremost, we have a mission as a business or as an organization that is defined in a program, and that is when we receive the facility itself, how well we have achieved meeting that program will determine how efficient and effective your organization is. So yes, we want to maintain, and there are concrete costs associated with that, and there are also costs that come with making sure we actually get efficient buildings. So the approach that we took that Kimon's going to show on the slides here, you can see here that we met after the National Institute of Building Sciences conference and got together in Seattle at our building here, and we really had a brainstorm through trying to validate this process. So really kind of walking through the steps, which is also an important aspect for owners to do, is to really demystify this. So Kimon, can you next slide, please? And so this is an example, as I was referring to, that you'll see that this is our PDF and some of the spreadsheets that we have where we outline some of the very basic functional requirements. I would suggest that you start where there aren't things that you really have any ambiguity about. If you start finding that you are debating this or that, whether something should be included or not, go to something that isn't ambiguous. Start with what are the list of spaces and what needs to be in them. That's as basic as you can get. So next slide. And the outcome of that is that you start to structure the data, and you start to to change the perspective of how we're going to communicate our requirements to a designer that's going to be trying to achieve these. So the next step was us kind of simulating taking those requirements and then laying them out in a programmatic way. And this is another misconception that BIM is the authoring platform for construction documents. And really what we're showing here is more of a programmatic view. So if you go to the next slide. And again, we kept moving it through the process to try to basically connect the dots from the requirements all the way through putting it into actual modeling situations. And next slide. And this also shows that we're not focusing on highly detailed configurations at this point. As a matter of fact, next slide. We're really looking at programmatic layouts, and we do want to have the data associated with it, absolutely. And next slide, please. And this is an example showing that the information coming from the programmatic level is very portable. It's not really platform specific. So this was an example of us testing that in a different platform altogether. But overall, the thing that this allowed us to do, and we demonstrated and were able to see, was that we were even able to check our programmatic requirements to validate them. But even more importantly, if we were to be pursuing this approach, when we receive deliverables from contractors, we would be able to validate that they met those requirements as well. So this is just a quick example walkthrough. At the end of the day, it's important to go through these types of examples internally, but it really comes down to really applying whatever the requirements are that you want to see happen in contract language. So I would definitely encourage the focus on the contract language. I would also encourage the focus on the minimum viable BIM, because you're also changing culture here. It's not just a technical problem. There's a huge change process. So I think this just gives you a view into some ways to get started, and I really appreciate the focus on bringing more attention to the programmatic side. So, Kimon?
Thanks, Sam. That was great. And one thing I'd like to add to that is the testing that we showed was happening pretty quickly over the span of a few days. And it moved quickly because we actually looked together at the Corps of Engineers' existing inventory of data that was available in whatever format. And then we looked at the VA standards that we saw earlier. What does VA call equipment and space? And said, what happens if we just use this database of VA equipment and just say, okay, it's an office or a chair or whatever. It's very similar, and just apply those same process and set of tools. Can we automate the pushing of the data into BIM? So it's borrowing and using either standards that have already been out there or other owners' ways of cataloging things, not reinventing the wheel, to get there quickly. And I think that what's the minimum viable product is incredibly important for all owners. And I think, Van, you even said that it's important for the Corps as well to get something delivered now rather than 3 to 5 years from now. What can we do with it now? And I think a lot of owners that we see are requiring the use of BIM, but now they're actually starting to face the dilemma of, we're getting all these BIM delivered back to us. What can we do with that, or how can we even get the basic data out of the models? And there's processes like COBE and everything, but if you think in terms of that from the very beginning of the project, not only at the end, you're going to have more outcomes that are that red dot, blue dot. You set the stage, you set the rules, and then you start interacting with your internal teams and then mandating the use of the same information and with the external teams that you work with. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but that was just my observation as we looked through these slides together.
No, I would say that's absolutely right.
Right. Great. So this particular section here, we're going to open it up to the panelists here. John, do you want to add any thoughts now that you've seen the other slides as we've gone through them, your thoughts back to what you said earlier?
We are seeing the common themes come up again and again in our presentations, and I think it's helpful for owners to remember. You're sitting on a mountain of data. It's important to start with what you have now, rather than waiting for some imagined perfect state for where your data and your standards will be. And even with partial steps, there's great opportunity in that. And with each step, you have the ability to link more and more information. I think Yvonne's presentation, made that case pretty well, that you start incrementally and you grow. I just encourage that idea to really sink in for all of our owners.
Right. And one thing with you, John, when you were involved with the California Community College, as a group of different owners within the district in California, the different districts in California that had, I think it was 5,000 buildings spread out throughout the state. When we started, it was hard to imagine that if you had 5,000 perfect BIMs, which there weren't, would that make a difference, or is it more important to start with the data that you had structured for the entire state to start making decisions about facility condition, for example, or space requirements? And that's what I think the realization was, that if we combine the minimum data that you already had, but it was very structured, along with the powers of the graphical tools of CAD, BIM, GIS, you can start seeing patterns and making decisions as an owner that are critical to you today versus waiting for that perfect world that's going to come 5, 10, 15 years from now.
Absolutely. There's no opportunity for an owner as large as the California Community College system statewide to have a perfect set of BIMs for every building. It's not a useful approach to seriously think about obtaining it, but just getting a portion of that inventory in that system is great help to the individual owners at the individual campuses and districts. And likewise, building the space inventory in a simple tabular form, as you showed earlier, basically a spreadsheet that has a common index for each of your buildings and rooms gives you the opportunity to do that. It really doesn't have to be as complicated as I think we often want to make it as owners.
Right, exactly. So another question for Van and John, either one, you can jump in on this, but this is an observation that I've made. Working through with a lot of owners, being involved in NIBs and discussions that happen about the needs for standards development, there seems to be always a struggle. I think everyone's well-intentioned to be able to need to get the objectives and the job done, but sometimes we're seeing parallel efforts kind of reinventing the wheel and being somewhat protective about what's being done versus the opposite of absolute transparency, or maximizing the transparency. So this work that we demonstrated today, a lot of questions that we get is, how in the world did we get VA and DoD to agree to open up their data to the world in the web service in a 100% public way? It's not an all or nothing proposition, but it was a huge, bold step for them to make a decision to share that information, because they need to share it among themselves internally, and they need to be able to connect with the outside world as they work with their consultants. But as the projects progress, obviously different levels of security need to be layered on, but the most important and fundamental thing is, if you can't get to your own data internally to make decisions, then you're really not running the organization in an efficient way. And as a government agency, it's part of your duty to the citizens to be able to be as efficient as possible. So these technologies that are there today, I think the opportunity from large owners like VA and Corps of Engineers and other agencies is to actually shift the industry. What are your thoughts about encouraging owners and agencies to share more of the resources rather than reinventing the wheel 1,000 times?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think that's a really good point that I see a lot of times, that sometimes we think we're talking about something that's very new and foreign and different, and we imagine kind of worst case scenarios. But a lot of times it's pretty simple. It's that, as you already described, Kimon, I mean, these things are already public. I mean, it's just because we're structuring the data, or just because we are making things able to be web serviced or imported or exported, at the end of the day, just look at what you currently do. And it should just be an extension of that. If you if you publish your requirements, then it shouldn't be a big deal. But it is definitely a situation where at some point it does become secure, and you do have to have a layer of security in order for this approach to be built in order to actually execute. So there's really a spectrum, and I think the earliest information is typically very most generic and is pretty open.
Right. That's a great response. Yeah, and I think the other challenge is that because now if we talk about building information modeling and file-based exchanges, we're all very used to putting all the data into one bucket and passing it to the next team, and that becomes a security issue in itself if you say everything is going to go into this BIM. But if we think in terms of these services that it's possible to plug and play these Lego pieces, you can decide, okay, this particular piece of data at this particular point in time is needed to be shared with the world, like we just showed. But once it moves into the actual design and construction of that facility, it's a different security level, and yes, you need to secure it. And what we found in the work through the NIMS projects, and this is actually Russ Manning from DoD, Defense Health Agency's quote, is it goes to the lowest common denominator, and everything is secured to that level. So if you ask the IT teams and the CIOs or whatever, if you don't really understand your data, you basically say everything is secure. Well, if everything's secure, you can't get to your own data to make decisions, but you really need to think in terms of how do you layer it, and it's actually possible to layer it, just like we demonstrated here. John, would you like to add anything else, or should we move on?
You pretty well tapped it right there. I did have it was recognizing that owners need to accept the fact that access and security don't have to be mutually exclusive, and so you can have access to data with elements of it being secure, the layering you just talked about. The other piece, though, tied to that is that while there is a risk of a security failure of sensitive information getting out, and that clearly has to be managed carefully and reliably, there's also the risk of not sharing information that allows you to make smart decisions sooner. And that has a real cost. There's a real cost of missing information that allows you to make logical, timely decisions about your buildings. And so I think that's also part of the spectrum that owners need to remember, is the cost of not knowing what you need to know at the time.
Exactly. That's actually a risk factor. If you don't know what your inventory is or your stuff is or your assets are, how can you possibly make decisions about them? And if an emergency comes up, how do you react to that emergency? There was a quote last year at the Asset Leadership Network from Dag Dieter, I believe, who made a presentation that said, imagine if a Fortune 500 or CEO or CIO of a company, publicly traded company, said, well, I have no idea how many square feet of facilities we have or how much is occupied or not occupied. We all know that government agencies are faced with that challenge, and the reason we're faced with that challenge as owners is it's hard to get to the information to do a dashboard and roll-up of very basic data. I mean, how much square footage does this building even exist, for that matter? We've seen that happen quite a bit as well, too, let alone is this room occupied or what piece of equipment goes in there. But from a data perspective, it's actually a pretty straightforward data approach. As long as you mandate and you set the stage of here's where our information is, and we're going to share it like this throughout the agency, throughout the organization, we're going to make it available. Okay, I think we can move on unless there's any other comments from Van or John, and we're going to be taking audience questions soon, but I think this concludes this section. All right, so next steps, don't reinvent the wheel. Inventory your data. It's a very simple first step. I know it's hard to find in all the sources of data, but just start with something. Even if you don't know where everything is, just start with something and create, say, this inventory exists here, and then catalog it and make it accessible, put it into a Excel file even, and post it on the drive that everybody has access to, or use Google Docs for that matter, or use your own database, but make it accessible to everybody so they know where to go get that authoritative source, so you don't have multiple versions of the same rules floating around. Share resources with others. Don't hoard information and knowledge. You have to move forward, including sharing resources with other owners and the world, and the Building Smart Alliance and the standards organizations. The Asset Leadership Network is a great place to do that. And the immediate next few weeks, we're going to have follow-up webinars. So next week, you're going to hear from a forward-looking architects, engineers, planners, contractors on what they're doing or what they can do with this type of data. So please join our next few weeks webinars. And think in terms of this Lego approach that we talked about. Follow us on the what we're building up on the facilities and assets, a life cycle playbook, as we're calling it, the 9 plays that we described, inventory list, starting with the very simple stuff. In the next few webinars, we're going to start showing what you can do, like number 7, with BIM and data, and what happens when apps start being built on top of this. Because once you catalog and make your data accessible, new functionality from the industry is going to start coming in, and you're going to find quickly who out there is capable from a consultant's point of view or from a vendor's point of view to respond to this. We're also have announced what we call a BIM Storm. A BIM Storm is an online, like a workshop that we've been doing for many years, and we're going to be bringing in this program to BIM element to it, and it's going to be concluding in Washington, D.C. in October at the Asset Leadership Network event at the National Academies of Sciences. So it's open to anybody for free to join and learn, and a lot of these steps are going to be shown there. Go to the website to look at the next upcoming webinars, and we'll be posting the recording of this webinar as we get to that point. And now we would like to go into questions and answers from the audience. And as we mentioned earlier, we really, because we have these 4 webinars, we wanted to give owners the first chance to other owners on the webinar to ask questions. And next few weeks we'll go into the other groups. So let's start with some of the questions here. Let's see, does this work for private owners or just government owners? This works for all. This is basically a formula that can be applied to any type of owner group. Does this work for materials in the building as well, besides equipment and buildings? And the answer is yes. It could be materials or attributes associated with it. We're saying this is a minimum set, and you can build on top of it.
Kimon?
Yes.
This is John. I would extend that, too, to recognizing that once you have this critical information connected, you can not only include information about the materials in your building, but you can start to build onto that information about the operation of the spaces or the operation of the assets. It doesn't have the data infrastructure that you're building by creating these linkages and standardizing the data sets allows you to branch out to start managing data of all kinds of activities that are going on inside those buildings. So it has great value also to the tenants and the operations aspect of the building.
Exactly, yes. It can be extended beyond that. We're just showing the minimum starting point. It's a great kind of thread throughout the life cycle, but other things can be plugged into it. Okay. There's a question about sharing critical infrastructure, and this goes back to the security comment that we made earlier. Van or John, if you'd like to address that as well, but I could go ahead, either one of you, or I could address it if you'd like. There's definitely rules. It's not a free-for-all. As long as you have the data structured and cataloged, once you get into more critical, secure information, yes, you don't want to have it open on the web publicly, but that's how things work, even with web, banking on the web and whatever. There's risks involved with it, but if you put it all in one bucket, nobody can get to it, and therefore it's a high risk, like John said.
And once you have the data connected in a BIM, there's many ways to present it, too. So that the information about critical infrastructure that might have a security component, you can display information in either tabular or as a BIM that's sanitized, that's simplified enough that it doesn't present critical information. You can have the linkages of critical sensitive information in the background, but the pieces that are being shared are shared in a format that's suitable to the individual use.
Right. And we have a question from Dublin, from Robert Moore. You asked, would an owner use the construction stage for the capture of information help with the handover? So I think you're asking, can an owner drive the format or where the data is structured to help in the handover. And yes, that's definitely the message that we're having here. If you start at the very, very beginning of the project, even before a project is even defined, if you have your basic structure data in place, it makes its way all the way through. Even on day one, it's essentially a COBie structured format, an international standard that COBie is typically thought of at the handover phase, but if you started from the beginning, you essentially have the minimum data in a COBie format that you can keep on layering more information and keeping those IDs throughout life cycle. And the next question was about employee information requirements. I didn't quite understand that, but I think it might have to do with security, and this goes back to, again, you can layer information. It's not an all or nothing. And just think in terms of how the internet runs. Everybody has logins to different things. We don't have access to everything, but our buildings and our facilities are typically put into one big bucket and handed over as a single file. But if we break it into pieces like this, anything is really possible. Van or John, anything you'd like to add to those? There's a couple more questions, but
I think you covered it.
okay. So that maybe Van, you can answer this, or you might. I could help on this as well too. But there's a question about this. Looks like a Defense Department dividend where the federal government has spent money to set up the process, and now anyone can use it. Is that the case? How does this work in the government and through NIBS? I guess is the question as these projects come up.
Yeah, and Kimon, I think you can speak to the actual projects that you completed, but I think just the big picture is that everything that we do is public domain, and it's in the public interest for us to make sure that not only are our tax dollars being spent as best as possible and most efficiently as possible, but that the industry is kind of being able to advance for the assistance of all. So there are some open source kind of items that are coming out of some of the NIBS work. But there are also National BIM Guideline for Owners that are kind of based off of some of the items that have been created out of the defense. But it really isn't Defense Department specific, but the things that are created here are public domain. So yes.
Okay, great. I agree with that too. That's part of the message here today. We're sharing how to do this to encourage interaction. So the best way to use this is to actually say, hey, well, you're using it for this, but here's how we can give back to that development. It's not, don't go off in a corner and do it yourself, basically. Yeah, there's a question about IFC from Pablo. What do you think about using IFC format for sharing open data? The answer from all of us, obviously, is absolutely. IFC is critical and important for building information models, but, and this is a controversial but, my opinion is that IFC discussions have gotten in the way of what we showed here today. This technology has been going on for quite a few years, and if we think IFC first, for example, if we went to that, the SEPS process even, and we went to the developers of the SEPS tools that were a government, the SPAWAR group that built it, and said, well, you first must understand IFC to build web services for SEPS. We would still be talking about it with them for another few years, but we went to them and said, you have a great structure of data. Can you open up a web service so we can get to that data? Because there are other tools that can consume it and do stuff with it, including BIM tools that can create IFC. That should be the discussion we should be having. We really need to open up parallel discussions of, yes, IFC, yes, COBie, yes, building smart, but there's a bunch of other really interesting and exciting stuff happening in the technology world out there that we need to latch onto and use. How can the owners validate the contractor supplied data? That's a biggie there. Van or John, would you like to address that?
This is John.
I can certainly tell you that if you don't have automated means to check for things, that it is unwieldy. But I'll tell you what's even more unwieldy is watching a room full of people look at a set of construction documents and then looking at their PDF requirements documents and manually trying to do the validation. So some of the effort kind of shifts from automating things that can be automated to be checked, which is an important aspect, and then also certainly the design professionals and the owners' representatives can be focusing on the higher level things that aren't just essentially counting elements or tracking basic items. So It's a very difficult problem to check data. I would definitely agree with the question that that's something you have to address.
But if you have structured data and a way to do that, then it makes it easier. Next week, we're actually going to be getting into more technical discussions and examples of that. But the VA work, there was a pilot that was done with millions of data points. Basically, once you have them structured like that, you can start doing comparisons across and saying, okay, where's this piece of equipment in this room? It's actually a pretty straightforward data problem. Now, if you're thinking of the entire BIM, then yeah, there's a lot of other complexity to it, and even the contractor supplied data is another layer to it. But this is the beginning.
In many cases, you can help address that problem by using your requirements definition phase before the contractors get involved to start defining the data structure you expect. Well, I'm thinking specifically of an example we ran into at the California Community Colleges. Because the system had tabular data of existing space inventories, if a district wanted to replace or modernize an old building, and there were plenty of them in the system, they could export the data from the existing inventory, turn that over to their planners and their architects and say, here's the inventory to start with as a requirement base that we need to replace. And then as they deliver a product back, a plan for review and approval, having the data structured allows for you to do a quality check to make sure that each of the required elements came back and was addressed.
Right, exactly. So we're a little bit past the hour here. I think we're going to need to wrap up and thank everybody for joining us today, and thank you to the presenters. Thank you, John. Thank you, Van. And to everybody that contributed to putting this presentation together, and to the Asset Leadership Network and Building Smart Alliance for being supporters of this. And we look forward to having other presenters come online in the next few weeks to join us. So please sign up for the next few webinars, and we'll continue this discussion. There's a few questions that were not answered here, but we will definitely get to them next week, since some of them were even a little bit more technical in nature. So thank you very much. I will be signing off now, and everybody join us again next week. Thank you.